Okay, so in my last couple of sermons, I've encouraged people not to freak out about the Trump presidency, not to overreact to Trump, not to worry unnecessarily. And I still encourage those things, but sometimes there are things worth worrying about. This week, Trump provided us with a few of those. So I wanted to talk those through, talk about how they might turn out. And I also wanted to talk about some hopeful signs that they may not work out as badly as you'd fear. So Trump nominated a number of people this week to various positions in his administration. I was happy with basically none of those, but a lot of my reactions were ideological. For example, in the foreign policy realm, pretty much everyone he appointed was an Iran hawk and a China hawk. I'm neither, so I'm not delighted about that, but that's ideological, and I'm not going to talk about that stuff. I want to talk about a couple of things that I think should really worry pretty much any American. These things got a lot of attention. I'm talking in particular about the appointment of Matt Gaetz as Attorney General and the appointment of Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense. Now, first, let's talk about Hegseth. So he is a guy I wasn't particularly aware of, a Fox News commentator, military veteran himself. There are a number of unflattering things I could probably say about him. I want to focus on one, and that is the case of Edward Gallagher, a Navy SEAL who, while on duty, did a number of atrocious things. And in fact, his colleagues, fellow Navy SEALs, attested to these things. Like, for example, he suddenly decided to stab a prisoner of war to death, 17-year-old guy they had apprehended. And then he grabbed the corpse by the hair and posed, took a picture of himself. Really bad stuff. Now, Hegseth played a big role in general appealing for sympathy for this guy and leniency. And in the end, Trump did reduce the punishment he had received and restored his rank, which had been reduced as a result of the case. And for good measure, Trump, and here I'm quoting from Wikipedia, announced over Twitter that he had directed the Secretary of the Navy to revoke Navy achievement medals given to members of the prosecution team that oversaw Gallagher's case. Okay, so there's no doubt that Gallagher is a monster, a psychopath, and was doing the kind of thing that should not be tolerated in the military. Now, I feel especially strongly about these kinds of things, I guess, because my father was a military officer. I grew up on and around military bases. I've always taken very seriously the ideals that are supposed to govern soldiers. My father took them very seriously, and I can't imagine many things that would be worse for the military than to have a guy who is Secretary of Defense and countenances war crimes as a matter of course. There are other things you could say about Hegseth that would not reflect well on his qualifications for the job, but I'll leave it at that. I do want to add that one thing that makes his appointment especially concerning is another thing Trump is talking about, which is basically purging generals he doesn't like from the highest ranks of the military. There's been talk of him setting up a board of retired generals and other flag officers, no doubt very specially selected to fire the kinds of generals Trump wants fired. He says that they'll be fired for wokeism, and I don't doubt that that's part of the motivation, but there can be no doubt that the generals left at the top of the hierarchy would be people that Trump thinks will be personally loyal to him. And, you know, there are dangers of having a president, especially one with Trump's pretty evident authoritarian leanings, who commands the personal loyalty of people at the highest levels of the military. You can imagine situations where there's chaos, for example, the kind of situations that might be caused by mass deportation, and there's civil unrest, and Trump, you know, wants the military to back him up, and that's controversial, and maybe you get a constitutional crisis. Anyway, it's just not a great thing for Trump to have that kind of personal loyalty at the highest levels of the military, and then having somebody like Hegseth, who is no doubt a loyalist as well in a personal sense to Trump. These are just obviously causes of concern. The other appointment that got so much attention, the Matt Gaetz one, has gotten actually so much attention that I won't dwell on it. You know, there were two separate investigations of him, one by the Justice Department, one by the House Ethics Committee, and they involved things like sex trafficking, drugs, various other things. And we don't know what the House Ethics Committee found. The Justice Department dropped the charges, but Gates resigned ostensibly because of this appointment, conveniently, like 2 days before the House Ethics Committee was going to release its report. So maybe we'll never know. But there's no doubt that he's kind of a sleazy guy, and also that he's just a rule breaker by nature, a chaos agent, and another guy who would be personally loyal to Trump. And in an attorney general, that's not a great thing. I don't want to act like it's the first time there's been that kind of concern about an attorney general that was valid. A lot of people thought it wasn't a great thing for Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother, to be attorney general, and I agree. But this is pretty egregious case of a guy who himself has pretty clearly broken the law, who would be in charge of enforcing the law throughout the land, a guy who would pretty obviously cut corners and break rules if he thought it would advance the personal goals of Trump. Okay, so these are things worth worrying about. Again, they're not the only things you could choose to worry about that happened this week in Trump world, but they'll do. Now for some good news, I would say, which is that some Republican senators have raised questions about the wisdom of these appointments, in particular the case of Gates, but also the case of Hegseth. And of course, you would need a majority vote in the Senate to confirm these guys. And already people like Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, and others have kind of said things suggesting they may not be on board. You would only need a total of 4 Republican senators to stand firm to stop these appointments. In a way, it's disconcerting that we're not sure we have those 4, but it looks like there may be that. And if that's the case, it would be nice if this early on in the administration, they had a chance to establish that, no, Trump can't run roughshod over them. He can't do anything he wants. That would be a nice precedent. And I think there's a reasonable chance that that will happen, at least in the case of Gates. I hope it happens in other cases. Now, the issue of recess appointments. Trump people have already talked about circumventing the Senate on these nominations by making them recess appointments. And that's this obscure thing where, according to the Constitution, under certain circumstances, when Congress is in recess, the president can make appointments, which are supposed to be on a short-term basis, sometimes wind up not being. But in any event, Trump has talked about using those. In fact, before the Senate Republicans had chosen their majority leader, Trump had said he was demanding a majority leader who would open the way for him to use recess appointments whenever he saw fit. And here there's good news right away, which is just that the Republicans did not choose the candidate for majority leader that Trump wanted. Okay, there was defiance there. They didn't choose Rick Scott. They chose a guy named John Thune, who is more of an institutionalist, that is to say, has a certain kind of respect for the Senate, which is nice since he's in it, and believes that it's important that there be some balance of power among the institutions in government. So anyway, that's just a good sign in itself, that kind of defiance of Trump, and it further reduces the chances that he'll be able to get away with this recess appointment thing. Now, there have been reports that Trump plans to use a clause of the Constitution that has never been invoked by a president to adjourn Congress so that he can claim it's an occasion for a recess appointment and sneak in the back door that way. So there could wind up being a kind of a constitutional crisis over the question of whether there can be a recess appointment. Now, the way you like to resolve constitutional crises is with the Supreme Court. And here there's a little more good news, which is that the Supreme Court had to decide on the issue of recess appointments during the Obama administration, and what they decided is auspicious, I would say. This was a case in which Obama had made recess appointments to the National Labor Relations Board. Ultimately, the court decided that the appointments were not valid. I won't go into detail as to why, but the interesting thing is that the 4 conservatives on the court, 3 of whom are still on the court, wanted the ruling to be even more emphatic than it was. So I'll quote from their dissent. This was written by Justice Scalia, who's no longer with us, but it was also signed by Roberts, Thomas, and Alito, all still on the court. And they apparently chastised the majority opinion, which had been written largely by liberals on the court, because it ensured that, quote, recess appointments will remain a powerful weapon in the president's arsenal. Then they wrote, that is unfortunate because the recess appointment power is an anachronism. So I don't know, was the fact that this was Obama using it a factor in their rejecting this particular tool of the president so emphatically? I don't know, but they're on record as doing it. And the point is that the existence of this precedent in and of itself will be a problem for Trump if he tries to pull what people feel he'll try to pull. And the fact that these conservatives on the court are on the record with the view I just quoted is also good news. So I'm guessing this recess appointment thing won't work unless the Republican leaders of the Senate and the House want it to work and want to pave the way for it. And I would say the early signs on that are kind of good. The fact that the Republicans didn't make Trump's choice the Senate Majority Leader, and the fact that you're already hearing rumblings about taking a stand on at least some of these nominations. So there are reasons to hope that this will work out well. In any event, it's probably not worth most of us lying awake at night worrying about it, because that won't help. We're aware of it. That's enough. If you happen to live in a state whose senator is one of the several in the Senate who is a Republican and might do the right thing, feel free to weigh in. You're one of their constituents, whether you voted for them or not. Call, email, whatever. For most people right now, there's no particular reason to get exercise. And, the institutions of this country are in many ways pretty strong. And we're about to get a test of two of them. The Senate, I would say certainly, and maybe the Supreme Court. And even at this point of Trump dominance within the Republican Party, you've got enough senators who will stand up and keep him from just running roughshod over the traditions of the country, which, by the way, include appointing decent human beings to important positions in the government. That would be a good sign. So, stay tuned. That's this week's wave of worry, at least from my point of view. There are a lot of things going on in the administration I'm not happy about. Then again, all presidents do things I'm not happy about. Biden did a number. I wasn't a big fan of his foreign policy. Trump does more things per week that bother me than the average president, for sure. But you kind of got to focus on the big issues, and I've tried to focus on a couple here. I hope this doesn't seem too at odds with my previous sermons where I emphasized calm. But, if you're going to try to maintain your credibility as a sedative, you have to be honest about when a certain amount of anxiety is in order and how to channel it productively. And I think if you think these things through, it's way too soon to freak out. That time may come. I'll try to be honest with you if it does. I may even just freak out to illustrate how to freak out. But for now, there's some good signs, and so we'll see what happens. Okay, so that's today's little sermon. If it makes sense to you, I hope you will subscribe to the Non-Zero newsletter, subscribe to the Non-Zero podcast, rate and review, and if you are watching this on YouTube, of course, smash the like button. Thank you.